jointly organized by the Natural Resource Governance Institute and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. This series was designed to draw further attention to the central role that national oil companies will play in the fight against climate change. The future decisions and practices of national oil companies will have massive implications on the climate, but also on the economies and the politics of their home countries, many of which are poorly prepared to adapt to the decline in the fossil fuel sector. In the first webinar, we focused on the economic risks that many NOCs are taking in their oil and gas portfolios, how they're assessing and mitigating those risks, and how their investments in future oil and gas projects could impact their country's ability to adapt to the energy transition. In the second webinar, we looked at how national oil companies might adapt and invest in renewable energy and other sectors that might support the diversification of their economies. But speakers also posed pretty tough questions about which NOCs are well placed to actually make the pivot into renewables. For those of you who would like to watch those sessions, and they were excellent, there were speakers from national oil companies, from different experts. The recordings are available, and my colleagues will put the links in the chat right now. Today, we're going to take on a different question. What drives national oil company decision-making, and what are the implications of that for climate action? Given the very unique profile of national oil companies and the power that they hold in many countries, what factors might cause a national oil company to facilitate the energy transition rather than block it? What kinds of external strategies might work in pushing NOCs in this direction? And what obstacles might those efforts confront? The stakes are really high. National oil companies produce more than half of the world's oil and gas, and they're slated to spend $2 trillion on new oil and gas projects in the coming years. But despite this, they've received quite a bit less attention than privately owned companies in global discussions on climate change. I want to make a couple notes about the scope of our discussion today. In the previous two webinars, there was a lot of attention given to the great diversity among national oil companies. Today, we're going to talk mostly about the large national oil companies, the big producers, so such as those from Russia, China, the Persian Gulf, Brazil, Mexico, those national oil companies that contribute the most to global production, but also emissions worldwide. Even among these companies, there's lots of diversity, but that'll help us at least focus the discussion a little bit. Second, we also wanted to mention up front the kinds of behavior changes that we had in mind when designing this session. So these are the kinds of actions that national oil companies could take to help address climate change. The four main ones are: one, reducing emissions associated with oil and gas production, so scope 1 and 2 emissions. The second is strengthening national oil company investments in clean energy technologies. And as we discussed in the second webinar, that's more appropriate for some national oil companies than others. Third is reducing the money they spend on future oil and gas projects, especially those projects that are particularly carbon intensive or that carry high economic risks. This is probably the most difficult type of change, and the most important because it really cuts at the core of their business. And then the fourth is, not being a spoiler in either their countries or the world's efforts to decarbonize. This one's a little more amorphous, but we think this issue of vested interests and the challenges they can pose is really important, especially because of the political clout that many national oil companies possess. So our plan for today is to start with some initial reflections from this fantastic group of experts that we have today, and then move on and have some time to do some interactive brainstorming. Our first two speakers will draw out some lessons from their efforts to influence different types of companies, so not national oil companies, but we think that we can draw some inspiration and some ideas from their experience of what might work in pushing national oil companies to change. First up will be Laurie Vandenberg, who will talk about her work with engaging and influencing privately owned international oil companies. Laurie is a senior campaigner at Oil Change International, where she works to move governments and financial institutions away from supporting the expansion of oil and gas. Previously, Laurie worked at Friends of the Earth Netherlands, where she led a climate court case against Shell. And congratulations, Laurie, and to your colleagues for the great success of that effort. Prior to that, she worked at the Overseas Development Institute as a climate and energy researcher focused on fossil fuel subsidies and energy access. Next will be Chido Muzondo, who will talk about her experience engaging South Africa's state-owned power company. So a state-owned company, but not an oil and gas company. Chido is an energy policy consultant with IISD's South Africa Energy Team. She holds degrees from Oxford and the University of Cape Town and works towards energy equity and shifting Southern Africa's reliance on dirty fuels to renewables. So after hearing from Laurie and Chido, we'll then turn to two experts on what makes national oil companies tick to share their initial reflections. Paasha Mahdavi is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Paasha's work focuses on the political economy of the oil and gas sector. He's the author of a book which I recommend to anyone interested in national oil companies called Power Grab: Political Survival Through Extractive Resource Nationalization. And he's done extensive research on national oil companies and how they interact with their governments and other stakeholders. Paasha is also a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policy and at the Payne Institute. Our final speaker will be Lourdes Melgar, who is a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University and a research affiliate at the Center for Cognitive Intelligence at MIT. From 2014 to 2016, Lourdes served as Mexico's Deputy Secretary for Energy for Hydrocarbons, and she was a member of Pemex's board, the National Oil Company of Mexico. Before that, she served as Mexico's Undersecretary for Electricity and served on the board of the Federal Electricity Commission. We're also very proud that Lourdes is a member of NRGI's board, and she sits on the board of Voz Esperta, an organization that supports the empowerment of women energy experts. After these initial remarks, we will then have a discussion about how change might happen when it comes to national oil companies and the energy transition. I'm going to loop back to each of the speakers in the same order so they can reflect on what they've heard and offer some other ideas, and then we'll go from there. During the remarks, please do type in any questions or ideas that come to mind into the chat, and we will work to kind of weave those points into the discussion and hit some of the questions as we go. I'm realizing as I've done all these introductions, I've forgotten to introduce myself. My name is Alex Gillies. I lead the anti-corruption programs at the Natural Resource Governance Institute and have spent a lot of time looking at national oil companies and in particular their political influence and some of the corruption situations that they have gotten into. So with that, I'm going to hand over the floor to Laurie. Now, Laurie, you've got this deep experience working to influence international oil companies that are privately owned, and there have been a few big wins in this area in the past couple months. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on what tactics have worked and when to help kick off the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Alexandra, and hi everyone. Thanks also to IISD and NRGI for organizing this webinar. I've really been enjoying the previous sessions in this series, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion. So I'm going to talk about campaign and advocacy tactics used towards international oil companies like Shell and Exxon, and I'll share some lessons learned from this work. But before that, I'd like to reiterate why we're having this conversation. And I'm just going to ask Joachim if you can put up the slides. then and go to the second slide, then I'll talk a bit about the graph that I've included there. Thank you. So I know this graph has already been presented in the first session of this series, but since it's so fundamental to this work, I've included it again. It was originally produced by Greg Mottit, and an updated version of it will be published in a forthcoming paper. It shows that the emissions from coal, oil and gas reserves in fields that are already operating or under development will already push the world beyond 1.5 degrees of global heating. And this means that staying below 1.5 degrees requires not only an immediate end to the expansion of fossil fuel production, but it also requires some fields to shut down before the end of their lifetime. And the IEA Net Zero report published in May confirms this and says that staying below 1.5 degrees means no more investments in new fossil fuel supply. This means that to meet climate goals and avoid stranded assets, getting governments and companies to plan for a managed phase out of fossil fuels is critical and a matter of urgency. And this is no news. For decades, campaigners have been focused on stopping fossil fuel expansion. And I believe that if one thing can be learned from these efforts, it is that, like in the case of the climate crisis, there is no silver bullet solution. I'd say that where oil companies have changed direction or are taking more climate action, that has happened thanks to a multitude of tactics used. And I'm going to talk about a few of those. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this all starts with research and analysis, that then importantly gets combined with clear communication strategies to make sure that it also gets used by advocates for climate action. So next to research focused on mapping the climate impacts of oil and gas companies, including the climate impacts of national oil companies, investigative journalism has helped to expose lobbying efforts by oil companies, predominantly private oil and gas companies, that has been focused on weakening or preventing climate action. And next slide, please. At OCI last year, we published a report that we're currently updating that examines the climate plans from selected oil and gas companies against 1.5 degree pathways. And this analysis that we published last year also covers two national oil companies, Equinor and Repsol. And I'd say that this could also be replicated for other national oil companies too. The analysis that we did at OCI shows that while an increasing number of companies have adopted net zero targets for 2050 or carbon intensity targets, few have concrete plans for ending fossil fuel expansion or reducing oil and gas production this decade, which is so critical for staying below 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. A strategy that is quite specific to work targeting private oil and gas companies is shareholder activism. And more recently, we've seen this lead to some important successes. This AGM season, a climate resolution filed by the shareholder activist group Follow This got adopted at the Chevron AGM. And that now means that Chevron will need to take action to cut emissions from its customers, so-called Scope 3 emissions. And at Exxon's AGM this year, climate activist shareholders voted in 3 new board members that are now supposed to promote more climate action from ExxonMobil, from their position on the board. Next slide, please. So I am currently focused on stopping the money pipeline for fossil fuel production. And like in all of these different areas of work that I've highlighted thus far, we're using a combination of tactics in this work. So research, direct advocacy with governments and with the public finance institutions. We're also organizing direct action and op-eds from influential people launched alongside high-level events like the G7. And together with partners, I am currently also focused on leveraging the leadership that we're seeing from a small but growing number of governments and public finance institutions that are adopting policies to exclude fossil fuels from their public finance. Next slide, please. And then there's also legal action. There's a rapidly growing number of climate cases worldwide, and out of a total of over 1,800 cases, there are 33 cases against fossil fuel companies. This also includes a number of cases against state-owned companies, including these 2 cases in Poland against a Polish coal company. These cases often use different legal strategies and that are focused either on due diligence obligation, human rights, fiduciary duties, or fraud. And often in these cases, there's also a combination of these legal angles that is being used. And in parallel to these cases against oil and gas and the coal companies, we're also seeing an increasing number of investor-state dispute settlement cases where companies are demanding compensation for asserted income losses caused by more stringent environmental or climate change regulation. And this was already briefly mentioned, but recently we've had a major breakthrough in the Shell climate case in the Netherlands, where the court ordered Shell to reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. Importantly, this emission reduction order also covers scope 3 emissions. And this is the very first time that a private company has been ordered to reduce emissions in line with 1.5 degree pathways by a court. Next slide, please. So a managed transition also means a good plan for workers and communities that are affected by a transition away from oil and gas. And this is why campaigners are also working closely with trade unions and oil and gas workers on the topic of just transition. In the UK, for example, the NGO platform commissioned a survey among over 1,300 oil and gas workers, which showed that 81% of the respondents would be open to move to other sectors if they had the opportunity to do so. And this work is really critical to ensuring that phasing down oil and gas production happens in a way that is just and doesn't leave oil and gas workers and communities behind. So this brings me to the last 2 slides. So next slide, please. There are a few lessons that I've learned from being involved in this work. The first one is that interdisciplinary collaboration and coordination is really key to achieving progress in all these different areas of work that I've outlined. So scientists, researchers, campaigners, lawyers, communication experts, even theater producers, students can also work together to achieve change. And then secondly, strong analysis is needed to guide campaign efforts. And it's really critical that that analysis gets combined with clear and accessible communication of key messages and also a repetition of those key messages so that it actually gets into the hands of the advocates who can then fight for change. And then there's also a need for strong and sustained campaigns at the domestic level. Work at the international level can help shift norms and is really critical in that way, but the required policy change largely happens at the national level at this stage. And this is why oil and gas companies also pay close attention to what is happening at the national level. Then I've already mentioned this, but another lesson is that there is a need for a multitude of tactics. And I think that the Netherlands provides a good example where youth climate protests, investigative journalism, shareholder activism, legal action, and even theater performances all helped create the conditions for a strong ruling in the Shell climate case. It's important to not forget about the people and communities that are directly affected by this transition. And this requires support to oil and gas workers and trade unions in securing just transition plans. And on the next slide, I have a few final lessons to share. Yeah, public pressure is key. And this also raises some important questions in the context of work targeting national oil companies. To what extent do the countries in which these national oil companies are located protect or respect the right to protest? To what extent does there exist a strong and active civil society in those countries? in the context of the work targeting private oil and gas companies, such public pressure has been really critical. So how do we leverage that in the context of work targeting national oil companies? There have also been a number of discussions between campaigners on the effectiveness of engagement versus disengagement or divestment in the context of work targeting private companies. I think that these strategies can be complementary and can also be mutually supportive, but there's also a risk of engagement leading to incremental change and delaying the serious and urgent action that is needed, which is something that needs to be considered in developing strategies for this work. And linked to this, there's also been a debate between campaigners on what demands to focus on in these campaigns targeting oil and gas companies. Should they be asking for what is perceived to be politically possible, or should they be asking for what is needed according to the science? I think one of the big lessons that I've learned from the work that I've been doing is that in times of crisis, things can change rather quickly. Even if we haven't seen things change in a really long time, suddenly then change can happen, and it can come quite quickly. And demands that might seem overly ambitious or unrealistic now might become common practice in a near-term future. And that's, I think, something we've already seen with Scope 3 emission reduction targets now being adopted by oil and gas companies, and also a number of oil and gas producers adopting oil production reduction targets. And on the next slide, I have some resources. I can also share the link to the slides so that you can directly access those. And yeah, that's my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, Laurie. Thank you so much. I think that gets us off to a great start. And as you were talking, I was already thinking about, how some of your lessons, I think, are enormously helpful as we focus on national oil companies, and others are incredibly complicated around, the domestic level dynamics and whether there's any public pressure coming from domestic constituencies within these oil-rich countries. And anyway, so lots of food for thought here. Let me shift now to Chido. With IISD, Chido, you've worked to encourage lower emissions practices with the state-owned South African power utility, Eskom, which I've learned is the largest electricity producer in Africa. What are some of the approaches that you've seen that have had the greatest influence, and some of the drivers behind and the motivations behind this state-owned company's strategy, and how has that influenced the approach that you and your colleagues have taken? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to IISD and the rest of the team for inviting me. I'm coming from Joburg. It's a very somber time at the moment. There's a lot of civil unrest and looting currently happening, but I'm glad to be here. So to answer your first question, Alex, how we've approached working. So South Africa, the state-owned entity, which is mainly responsible for electricity generation in the country, is called Eskom. And they account for about 94% of all generation capacity within the country. They also largely control the transmission and distribution of electricity. And also, just to put into context, coming from Laurie, who spoke from an international level, in South Africa, aside from Eskom, 88%, as of 2019, 88% of our electricity comes from coal, with a very less than sort of 1% coming from oil. So it's quite a different makeup from what we see in other countries. Whereas if we're talking about the total energy supply, so not just electricity, about 73% comes from coal, with about 15% coming from oil. And so how we have to date sort of worked with Eskom, and I think an approach that's very has been successful to date really, is working with Eskom not sort of as an adversary, but publicly acknowledging where they are making some successful progress, where they are working to reform their practice, and then, of course, using that as an entry point to then say, this is where we think the utility could be doing better. And that's an important approach because as basically the sole provider of electricity in the country, there's a lot of negative conversations around Eskom and their continued focus on coal-powered energy. So of course, that can be quite, that's not very constructive when you want to open up a discussion about how we can help, to reform practice or to influence change. And so we found that that's been very helpful. We had a webinar last year where we were looking at electricity sector reform, looking at case studies from Mexico and in India, and we were actually glad to have somebody from within the utility themselves come on to the webinar and read our research and contribute to the discussion. And since then, we've been talking to them about what they're doing in terms of renewables. They have some exciting work coming up for COP26. So really, that's sort of one approach that we've taken. The second really has been a subsidy watchdog. And we are at the moment currently writing a report looking at sort of energy fiscal policies in the country in South Africa, which should be published in November. And what we've seen, for example, in the most recent financial year, Eskom received about $2 billion in bailouts, which, although that's quite a large figure, it has decreased in the past few years, but it's still quite significant. And so part of this inventory and this work that we're doing and the work we want to continue to do with Eskom is to firstly make this information publicly available, because trying to find out what energy fiscal support or subsidies the utility is getting is hard to find. But then trying to figure out, okay, well, what could the future look like where this sort of subsidy is significantly reduced or does not exist at all? And having those conversations within the utility is sort of where we want to be moving towards as we're publishing this work. So that's sort of the two approaches we've taken, really, the watchdog, and then also trying to be a constructive participant in feeding back to Eskom's processes. In terms of, Alex, your second question regarding the company's strategy and how that's influenced our approach. So Eskom's main drivers have been sort of financial. So the utility is heavily indebted. And so part of their work has been trying to ensure and maintain financial viability and to ensure a sustainable company. They also have, a variety of other goals, which include try to reduce impact on the environment, which is, questionable, but also, provide reliable and predictable and affordable electricity, which is important in South Africa, where we're currently experiencing severe blackouts due to issues with the utility. So issues with the supply, not maintaining the old power stations, and especially now in winter for us now when demand really has increased, people with heating, that's severely pressurized the grid. And so we also know some of their drivers. So besides the financial aspect is sort of coming from the government. So because they're a state-owned entity, they are sort of overarchingly governed by the Department of Public Enterprises. And so they've really set the agenda regarding where they want the utility to be going. Of course, the utility has its own CEO and board of governors who then run the day-to-day, but that really is part of sort of their drivers, is to fulfill that sort of government stated mandate that's put forward by the Department of Public Enterprises. And then the last two that the first is public opinion, which is one of the main drivers as well. And it's quite interesting because, I sort of mentioned it earlier, but there's a lot of discussion in the country about the energy transition, about the future of South Africa's energy system and the crisis that we're in. And that comes from sort of NGOs, academia, from labor unions who are very strong in the country, but also from, faith-based environmental groups. So there are a lot of parties and a lot of sectors in the country, and the private sector as well, who are engaging in this conversation around what is Eskom doing, how are they prioritizing the future of the entity, and so that also influences some of the decision making. Of course, not to a great degree or great extent, but definitely that is there. And I'll be interested to know, what that looks like in other countries as well. And then lastly, one of the other main drivers is what I just also pointed to, sort of the union opinion. So there's a very strong presence of labor union in the country, particularly because we have such a large mining industry. And so part of that really is those groups are very vocal and often are engaging with Eskom regarding the future of the utility and how Eskom is prioritizing its transition away from coal. So then your last question regarding how that's influenced our approach. I think our primary goal really has been to change government policy by engaging with technical staff within ministries. So to date, the South Africa program has been running for about 18 months, and that's, very short time, but we've had the pleasure to be able to engage with, and are continuing to do so with, sort of technical staff from departments like National Treasury, so the Environmental Taxes Office, which of course directly affects, things like the subsidy watchdog point that I mentioned earlier. We've also had the pleasure of engaging with the senior or the economic advisor to the president in the Office of the Presidency, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and then of course the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, in addition to Eskom. So really our work and our approach really has been trying to target those very key stakeholders in those ministries who directly affect the governance of the utility, the future of the utility, and trying to bring about sort of change in those spaces. The secondary goal has also been to change public opinion. So I think, like I said before, it's very easy to come down on fossil fuel companies, and of course I'm not a supporter of that, but we also have to be cognizant of how we approach conversations with them to make sure that it's a relationship that is positive, a relationship that they're receptive to working with us, to learning from IISD's experience in other countries, for example, in India and Indonesia, where we work as well. And so we really are very aware of how we engage with them. And that leads me to the last process the last point, where part of our future work as a South Africa team looking forward is really we'd like to be sort of an insider to reforming processes within Eskom. At present, we've engaged with Eskom has a unit called the Just Energy Transition Office, which is supposed to sort of oversee the strategic transition of Eskom from a coal entity to hopefully net zero by 2050, as they've stated. And so we've had some engagements with them, various people in that department, but also other spaces within Eskom. So we really want to continue to sort of mold that working relationship with them and be more strategic about how we influence the planning that they're doing and the work that we're doing. I hope that answers your questions, Alex, and happy to take any more.
Great. That was great, Chido. Thank you. You covered a lot of ground, and I think there's some really instructive observations there, including about the different agendas and stakeholders that influence Eskom's behavior. I mean, I think there's some parallels to national oil companies when you have an indebted company. So of course it's concerned about its financial viability, but its government owners are one of the main sources of the financing it receives. So that's a very complicated relationship. And then on the kind of more public opinion side, that, yeah, it sounds like very active groups concerned about green energy issues, but then also a very large population that just wants reliable power supply, and that those agendas may not always fit together perfectly. And I think there's some parallels there in oil producing countries where public opinion, might be mobilized around climate change, but there's still in many countries a sense that, the revenues that come from the oil sector, we have an interest in those continuing as well. So lots for there. Thank you. I'm gonna shift gears now and go to Paasha. Paasha, based on your comparative research on national oil company strategy and governance, what do you see as the different pathways for influencing national oil company behavior specifically? Thanks.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Alex. And I also like to express my thanks to IISD and NRGI for having me. It's really been a great conversation so far today, and also a great series overall so far. So I'm going to answer some of the questions you posed, and thinking about some of the questions from before as well, kind of from a political economy perspective, using a more generalized framework for understanding NOC behavior and decision making. But I'll note up front that this is indeed a generalization. And as Alex noted, that we've talked a lot in this series about how much variance there is in NOCs. And of course, that carries over to how much NOCs vary across governance structures, and sometimes often are hybrid of different corporate governance models. But with that in mind, for the major producing NOCs that we're talking about today, it seems to me that there are kind of 4 different levers of decision-making that stand out as different pathways to influence NOC behavior. So of course, the first lever for this framework is kind of political leadership, right? This is the most obvious in many ways, but it is, of course, true that the most powerful driver of NOC decision-making and behavior is going to be government mandate. And both, Laurie and Chido alluded to that as well. And this is, of course, the typical perspective of what drives NOC decision-making. But I do want to note that within this framework, it's important to see that leadership, this idea of political leadership, is not monolithic. Right? Of course, it includes the executive leader at the top, the president, the prime minister, or the monarch, royal court, etc. But it also includes the legislature. It also includes other elites, sometimes other bureaucracies and ministries, as Chido mentioned for ESCOM. So there are competing pressures within the realm of political leadership. But with that in mind, when it comes to the energy transition, the question really becomes, how much does the government and its leadership believe a transition is going to happen? That's going to be kind of the key driver for what they tell the NOC what to do. And of course, among the major net exporters, the countries that Alex had alluded to, the Persian Gulf, Russia, Mexico, and Brazil, the answer seems to be tacitly, yes, it will happen, but they're all striving to be kind of the last one standing in a carbon constrained world, right? And that means that governments want their NOCs to keep producing. So you've seen this kind of lever play out in the last few years in the UAE in particular. It's kind of nice to see Ben Cahill here as well. He's done a lot of great work on this. And we've seen in the UAE, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed completely transforming the national oil company, Abu Dhabi NOC or ADNOC, the strategy going from what had been conservation for posterity to now focused on ramping up production rapidly, trying to hit 5 million barrels per day by 2030 from about 3 million barrels per day in 2017. Of course, that's been widely in the news the past couple of weeks. NBZ's also tried to force the company to shed a lot of non-upstream assets so it could focus on just the upstream. But it's also put the NOC in charge of one of the largest carbon capture and utilization storage projects in the region at Al Rayada. And so there is a sense of NOCs continuing to produce and even ramping up production as much as they can, but to try to do so cleanly and in a way that might fit within kind of future policies. Within clean energy, you look at renewable projects in particular, there are some interesting examples among the major NOCs, and one that caught, that I've been trying to work on a bit is the Kuwaiti government kind of mandating the Kuwaiti Petroleum Corporation, the country's NOC, to take on kind of a second phase of this, large scale 1.5 gigawatt addition to the Shagaya solar project over at Al Dabdada. But it's interesting, I note this because it feeds nicely into what I think is the second lever, which is internal NOC leadership. Right? It's not just top down. And this kind of refers to the managing directors of NOCs, the chairman, the NOC board sometimes. And here's where you have some parallels with IOC corporate governance structure and other SOE governance structures. And I raise this because it's important to see that government mandate is not everything. The NOC itself can drive government policy, especially given its political influence. Right? This is what political economists refer to as a classic principal agent problem. And it exists in many national oil company settings. part of the reason for this also is again, that political influence. NOCs have their hands in almost every layer of a state's political economy. There's lots and lots of examples for this, but in terms of the energy transition, it's interesting to think about how this can work. And we've seen it work both positively and negatively. So on the positive side, you have an example like we have in Oman, something that came up in the previous sessions as well, this ongoing development of the Mira 1 gigawatt solar thermal project for enhanced oil recovery. If you dive into the political economy of that project, you'll see that it was driven by internal interests of the NOC, the majority state-owned company, PDO, in their own effort to reduce enhanced oil recovery costs, but also to project a bit of what's been called soft power in the sense of international reputational benefits. So it's kind of a prime example of internal NOC levers pushing for change, in this case, pushing for renewable investment, really in order to sustain its own business model of continued oil and gas extraction. And of course, there's lots of negative examples of NOCs pushing back or overriding government mandate. And just with the Kuwait example that I mentioned before, just last June, KPC pulled out of the Dabdaba solar project. They basically told the government, look, we can't take this on. We won't take this on in today's market climate. And KPC is effectively, leaving Kuwait's only major solar development out to dry. So those to me are the two prime levers. But the next two of the four figure less prominently, I think, in NOC decision-making, but it is worth considering kind of as possible frontiers in climate advocacy, as we just talked about before. And of course, the third lever is going to be, domestic public pressure and non-petroleum industry pressure. Both Laurie and Chido noted important aspects of this. And with the major NOCs, what we've seen is not so much that this has been effective in urging NOCs to undertake a new strategy, but rather it has been effective in stopping NOCs from certain developments. An interesting example, you think about Iran's non-petroleum industry has pushed for some time to block the national oil company's ambitions for LNG exports, liquefied natural gas. And of course, LNG exports have been largely a failure for lots of reasons, but a big part of this is pushback from industry on the basis of needing gas for their own domestic industrial uses and electricity. And so it has been effective in some contexts, even where we might not expect it to. But there are limited examples, I would say, overall of domestic public and industry pressure working, especially in the major NOC contexts. They operate in places where oil just provides really the vast majority of government revenue. It drives the economy. And so there is an inherent challenge in kind of the role of non-state pressure on oil decisions. And it's interesting to note that even the most robust civil societies among the Middle East, the petrostate producers like Kuwait, Bahrain, and Iran, these countries tend to fare the worst in clean energy and environmental policies. That's kind of an interesting pattern. So the last thing I'll say is the fourth lever, which I'm happy to talk more about in a bit, which is the role of international pressure, right? Financing and investment, and kind of the general case for increased reliance on international finance, investments and partnerships with IOCs and service companies and trading companies. And this is going to be key for some, but not all NOCs, in particular those that need exploration to satisfy long-term demand, kind of like the UAE example. So to kind of wrap up, I'll say that all four of these levers exist in a connected web of governance and can in fact influence each other. And really that internal NOC lever is quite powerful. And even the most politically well-connected NOCs can diffuse their own internal interests onto key constituencies in the public. Chido had mentioned the role of unions, for example. We've seen that play a big role as well in terms of how they can get pressured by NOCs and within various levers of government. International pressure, for example, influences domestic public opinion and interests, and so on and so forth. And so it's not enough to say that change can come from above, that governments can simply tell NOCs what to do, but rather, as Laurie alluded to with the IOCs, I think a multitude of levers and pressures are needed to impact NOC decision-making and behavior. So I think I've exhausted my time, but I'll hand the conversation back to you, Alex.
Great. Thank you, Paasha. I think you gave a very clear overview of some of the different levers, as you said, and I think that's a good framework for us to, use moving forward in the conversation. Let me shift now to Lourdes. I mean, Lourdes, you've seen up close the ways that governments and NOCs interact and make decisions about what investments to make and sustainability practices. What are some of the challenges involved in motivating a national oil company to support energy transition goals, and what are some factors that might help kind of deliver positive change in this way? Lourdes, over to you.
So yes, thank you very much, Alexandra. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you to NRGI-IISD and to NRGI for inviting me to this fascinating conversation. And yes, this has been a tremendous series. So it is, I think it's great for me to follow up after Paasha, because as I was listening to him, I was thinking, if I had heard him a few years ago, I would have agreed with everything. But seeing what Mexico has been going through over the past few years, I guess there are a lot of lessons learned from how the energy transition path is taken, and what NOCs or do or cannot do in terms of accelerating or stopping the energy transition. So I'm going to get to something very obvious, but which is that the energy transition is not linear. And I think this is what we have seen in the Mexican case. Mexico sort of became one of the champions of the emerging economies in terms of trying to fight climate change and getting to climate agreements after we had COP16 in Cancun a few years ago. And for two governments in a row, climate change became something that was part of the discussion, at least of the discussion and the design of policies. And what we have seen with the arrival of President López Obrador is a backlash. And I think it's important to note that it's not a backlash necessarily because there is no commitment to climate change, but it's more a view of the role that the oil sector plays in boosting national development. And it's also a view of how governments should run natural resources, and specifically, oil resources as a bastion of sovereignty, and also as a bastion for furthering economic development. So in this regard, issues related to the environment and to climate change mitigation become seriously, undermined as priorities. And so, in thinking about what the role is and how NOCs can be influenced, I think one of the issues, and I like very much what Paasha said about political leadership and the balance that you can have with different types of leaderships. That's true if you have different leaderships, powerful leaderships. But when you have a very strong president, as it is right now the case in Mexico, where he has control of Congress and he has, a big influence over, over his ministers, his cabinet, it is very difficult to have a different view. And so I think the case of Mexico is really interesting to look at, in the sense of seeing what are the pieces that are needed, but also what are the things that you need to do to ensure that over time this will be sustained and that you're not going to just get a big backlash. So of course, the vision, the political will are essential, as is the policy that is derived from them, the regulations, and of course the regulators. And here you need independent regulators. And one of the things that we saw in the case of Mexico is that with the design of the energy reform, we established independent regulators for the energy sector, including one in charge of industrial safety and environmental protection. But as we saw just recently with the major accident that you saw in the in the Gulf of Mexico with the Eye of Fire that we had at the beginning of the month on July 2nd, the response from the regulator was that, there was no damage. And the entity in charge of doing the root cause analysis of the accident, which by regulation should be ASEA, is now Pemex, the national oil company. So that shows you how it is really essential to be able to have the regulators really be in charge and at the same time be able to enforce the accountability that is needed on behalf of the oil companies. And then another issue, which is obvious, and I love the sentence that that was mentioned about the pipeline, the financial pipeline, which is, we often forget about financing. But I think when we design an energy strategy, it is essential to make sure that we have the financing, not only within the budget, but also the funding, and the entities to be able to attract, for instance, international funding. There is funding from the World Bank, from IDB, from development agencies that in the case of Mexico have been key in boosting the energy transition in the past, but that, for instance, now have been undermined by the present administration, which has basically blocked the entrance of these funds. But those are keys, because if we talk about energy transition and we don't provide the means for doing it, it is very hard to advance in some of the things that need to be done. For instance, let's take the case of no gas flaring. Well, it makes sense, it sounds great, but if you're not able to invest in the equipments that are needed to ensure that you're not flaring the natural gas, the methane, then you're going to continue burning it. And I think that's the case for many of the national oil companies, that they have so many demands at different levels that it is very difficult to meet them all when they have limited budgets, when they are heavily indebted, and when they have a lot of economic demands on behalf of the government. So what do I mean by this? Well, in the specific case of Mexico, for instance, right now there is this clear view that Pemex is the motor of development. And therefore, there is this whole view of, how oil production and oil refining is going to be the source of revenue for the government and of job creation, develop all the supply chains. And so when you think about the energy transition, you need to think out also, what do you make to make sure that when we talk about the just transition, and often enough we hear the phrase, we need a just transition, and we need to think about the conversation with the unions and this and that, but we need to really tackle it. What do we mean? What is the plan that we are going to draft with the workers, with the people who have made a profession or a career path out of the oil industry? How are they going to move into something else? What is this something else? When we talk about the framework, perhaps it's easy for a company such as Shell to say, we're going to commit by 2030, which is only 8 years away, to make this big shift. But for a national oil company, it is difficult. So we need to make sure that if we want to be able to sustain the energy transition, that we give enough importance to these elements. And I think Mexico does not have right now, its oil company does not have a net zero commitment. We can actually see how even there was a step back because we left the oil and gas climate initiative, of which Pemex was part of. So Pemex is no longer part of that. But it's kind of interesting how the president is framing the transition in the oil sector. And basically what he has said is, we are making our contribution because we are not going to produce more than 2 million barrels a day. So his target was 2.4. There are other reasons why we are not able to reach that target, but he said, this is our ceiling, 2 million barrels a day. We're not going to export. Well, that's a political statement, I think, because there are other reasons why Mexico needs to export oil, but that's part of what he has made as a commitment. There's a commitment not to do fracking. there's a commitment not to go into deep water exploration. So there are elements that we can look at, which from a transition, from an energy transition, climate change mitigation makes sense. They're probably not enough. They're definitely not enough, especially if, as in the case of Mexico, we are building refineries, burning fuel oil, and getting into getting away from complying with our commitments within the Paris Agreement. So let me just finish up my comments by saying that the big risk for NOCs and for countries such as Mexico is that, as we are seeing in the view that the world has in terms of the post-COVID recovery, it's a green recovery. It's a commitment with the environment and with climate change. And it's not just a matter of not being able to tap the green credits and green financing and all of that. It is the fact that there are very serious conversations in Europe and in the United States and in other parts of the world about establishing carbon taxes, and about border adjustment taxes, and about not being able to attract other sorts of investments into the country and generating the much needed employment. So I think part of what needs to be put on the table in the facts that governments and NOCs consider is not just the very short term, but the medium term. What does it mean in the medium term if you turn your back to climate mitigation? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think with those last two speakers especially, we've got a good sense of the scale of the challenge. I mean, we've got national oil companies, for the most part, positioning themselves to try to be the last man standing in the industry and are still pursuing a path of growth in many cases. And I think the current price of oil reinforces that type of thinking and creates a real obstacle for motivating change in many of these contexts. I mean, even with, as Lourdes, as you mentioned, this current government identifying Pemex as the engine of economic growth and the growth trajectory that ADNOC is on in a very different country context in the UAE. So that sets out the challenge, I think, quite well. But in your remarks were also some of the opportunities, if I can put a positive spin on it, of, that these companies are exposed to different financial markets. Some of them are listed on different stock exchanges like Petrobras and others, but even those that aren't often rely on international financing in various ways for different projects or on international partners. Most governments are trying to kind of juggle green commitments while also managing their oil industry, and that creates opportunities for progress. But I think some of what you said, Lourdes, was a good segue back to Laurie, which is like, what are we asking for here? And how ambitious does the change need to be that advocates and campaigners and others are pushing these national oil companies towards? Because they're, just repeating what Laurie said, there can be incremental steps that sometimes feel feasible politically, especially given the challenges I just mentioned, but that pale in comparison to the scale of the challenge that we're facing globally in terms of the climate crisis. So I think we're getting into some of the real meat of what makes designing strategies in this space so difficult. So, we've heard this diverse range of reflections. I want to loop back to you, Laurie and Chido, just to give you a second to come in and reflect on what you may have heard from the other speakers. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting presentations. And I've been reflecting a little bit on what Paasha has said and also on what Lourdes has said. And when it comes to these levers of change, and particularly when it comes to the political leadership and the leadership also at the NOCs. And of course, I hear also from you, Lourdes, that it's also challenging to target such leadership in countries where a president has such a strong control also over ministers and cabinets, etc. Yeah, this reminded me of a campaign that OCI has been involved in, which has targeted political candidates and asked them to sign a pledge to reject support from fossil fuel companies for their campaigns. Yeah, I'm just wondering if this would be also a way of engaging the leadership, either in governments in countries that have national oil companies, or the leadership at the NOCs themselves, invite them to make personal pledges on their commitment to the energy transition, and to move beyond fossil fuels, or at least investigate how to make that move, what that should look like, what that means for workers, etc. Then I'm also hearing that finance is an important lever, which we've also seen in the context of private oil and gas companies. This also means that as we're increasingly seeing finance institutions adopt restrictions for oil and gas finance, there is also a need for these institutions, as Lourdes was also mentioned, to also support economic diversification and help countries that are heavily reliant on revenue from the oil and gas industry diversify their economy so that they're less reliant on the industry and can make the transition. Yeah, this also brings me to one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A around the pace of change that we need to see in developing countries versus the pace of change that we need to see in the rich countries. There's a really interesting paper that was written by Greg Mottit and Shivam Karta that talks about an approach to a managed decline of oil and gas production that also takes into account equity principles. And that comes to the conclusions that from an equity perspective, it's the rich countries that have the biggest responsibilities for greenhouse gas emissions historically, and that have the resources, and those diversified economies that need to move quickest in phasing out oil and gas production. So if we look at the UNEP production gap report that says that we need to see a reduction in oil and gas production of respectively 4% and 3% annually between now and 2030 globally on average. That means that rich countries need to go faster than that, and developing countries can then comparatively move a bit slower. That said, the IEA report has of course concluded that there can be no investments in new fossil fuel supply from now on to meet 1.5 degrees. There was also an increasing body of research that shows the risks of extractive-based development, especially in the current political context and in the context of the climate crisis that we're currently in. Yeah, also even in the developing countries, we do need to say that change, but there's definitely an equity approach that needs to be taken there with the rich countries moving quicker. So those are a few initial reflections. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laurie. And yeah, I encourage you to look at the Q&A if you have a minute, or direct questions or comments amongst each other. Chido, any reflections or comments from you?
Yes, thank you, Alex. I think I quite liked what Paasha and both, of course, Lourdes presented. Thank you for those presentations. I think what Lourdes spoke to regarding political leadership, and also Paasha, for us is quite tricky because we're in a situation where the president is quite ambitious regarding the transition away from fossil fuels, but the actual ministry responsible for that, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, is not as ambitious, and by and large is interested in pursuing other sorts of non-clean energy. So for me, I mean, this is not a question, but yeah, just a thought, I guess, for our countries. How do you align when the leadership themselves don't align? And what does that look like? Because, you know, the president only has so much power, but within the ministry, the minister is the one who sets out the energy plan for 5 years, you know, and who allow certain things to take place legislatively speaking. So I think for us, we've seen that's an issue and something that is a constant struggle. The president will be invited to the G7 summit as a visitor, will say certain things and make certain commitments, but then that doesn't trickle down to the ministry. And that's quite frustrating. I think also the point of financing also, I think we're also trying to currently sort of tease out what it looks like for an SOE which is heavily indebted to not only transition but also invest in renewable energy. And this links to a question that was posed in the Q&A about is Eskom going to move over to renewables and how soon? So sort of to answer that, the utility has expressed that they have an interest in moving over to renewables, but the pace at which that's going to take place is not publicly known. I would imagine the Just Energy Transition Office, which I spoke about, sort of is developing an internal strategy which will become available. So we don't know what that looks like. We know that they've said by 2050 they do hope to be net zero, but practically what that looks like, how they're going to manage to invest in new energy and address the issue of their current balance sheet, again, is very complicated. And there are a variety of options that are on the table. But again, what that's going to look like and the time frame within which that's going to happen, we are not sure. So there's a lot of, I appreciate your presentations. A lot of it sort of rings true for us. And there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the future of the utility and the future of them, I mean, with respect to renewables. But we, are working to contribute to that work. And we hope that they'll be willing to engage with a variety of stakeholders, as we know they are, and as we've already started to do so with them. So that those are just a few of my my thoughts.
Great, thank you, Chido. Paasha, there's a couple questions in the Q&A for you that I see that you're typing away. Feel free to address those, but I also want to kind of put you on the spot a little bit. I mean, in Laurie's presentation, initially, she uses the phrase, managed phase out as the goal for the industry generally, but for individual companies. And that it's interesting to, try to think in the context of an oil dependent country with a big national oil company, if that's the scale of change that's ultimately needed, even as a thought experiment, how does that become politically an option on the table? And are there any kind of, I'm just interested in your thoughts around, if that's kind of one of the end goals, what might be intermediate steps politically towards getting there? If you had any reflections, while noting that's an incredibly difficult question.
No, it's a great question, and I'll also kind of share my praise for the other speakers, for Laurie, Chido, and Lourdes' thoughts. Learning something new every time we have these great series. So it is a difficult question, and I think for some governments they're going to keep going until they can't. I think there is a sense that they can remain, they can turn things around while staying committed to fossil fuels, right? And I think it's great that Lourdes kind of brought into this point about the difference between the short term and the medium term and even the long term, right? The UAE is a perfect example, right? They might see in the long run, they're not going to be able to produce oil anymore, and they're not going to be the absolutely lowest cost producer compared to the Saudis, for example. But what does that mean for the short term? Well, that means they're going to put a lot of their eggs in producing oil now and producing it as cleanly as possible, ramp up their ability to take market share at the moment, and then think about diversification, as Laurie had mentioned, to try to protect the economy. But of course, diversification away from oil is something these governments have been trying to do for 50 years. And it has not, by and large, succeeded the way that many have wanted to, especially for these major net exporters that we're talking about. So I don't have a great answer for how these governments are going to come to that point without kind of seeing the writing on the wall. And I think what you're particularly going to see is countries that are going to have a challenge in supplying longer term demand without any, with needing investment in exploration for the next 5 to 10 years. they're going to be the ones that can be most affected by climate advocates, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to rely on international finance and susceptible to the role of civil society. And I think there you'll start to see a bit of weakening and a managed phase out be taken seriously. But for those who don't have to do that, the Saudi Arabias of the world, the Russias of the world, there's not much that will change that opinion other than a complete demand shift. And so that puts the onus again on advocacy to change demand for fossil fuels and increase electrification, things like the clean electricity standard being talked about in Congress here in the US right now. Those are the kinds of pressures that can be put on, because it seems to me that demand side might be the only way to address some of those producers.
Great, thank you very much. And I want to flag just one question that just came in the Q&A, which I think is really important, from an anonymous person, so I can't give credit, which is there evidence for a first mover advantage among NOCs to invest in diversification? And at the second webinar, we had a speaker from Denmark's national energy company, which I think is an example of a company that's reaped the benefits of having made the transition over the past decades. And to the, I think we need to explore more what are the opportunities for other national oil companies to make that pivot, while also being quite critical around which ones are well placed to do so. I mean, I think, Laurie put up the slide of her organization's evaluation of the different climate commitments by the IOCs. There does need to be a lot of careful reading of these climate commitments that national oil companies make, especially around renewables and diversification. Many have failed to turn a profit in the oil industry, even when prices were extremely high. And so will they be able to be effective actors in the renewable space? I think is, can't just be taken for granted in many cases. So I think that's a really crucial line where more research, more discussion is needed. Lourdes, let me let you come back in with any final thoughts that you have. Thanks.
Yes, quite a few. Well, first of all, I think just getting to this last question, I do think that there is something to be gained if you are an early starter in the transition, especially if you're not, a low cost producer. If you're not like a low cost producer with high quality oil, then I think it makes sense to make the transition. And I think it's very interesting to look at what Colombia is doing, Ecopetrol is doing with this strategy to really have, accelerate this transition just as its production is declining, which is something in a way that, was part of what was thought as a strategy for Pemex. And here, let me stress one of the differences in the Mexican case, which is part of the reason why I think we really need to think of this, not just in economic sense, but from a political, with a political lens, which is Mexico. It's a country that has been able to diversify its economy, or the oil sector represents less than 10% of its GDP. So it's not a petrolized country. We don't depend, our economy doesn't depend on oil, except in the mind of our president, who thinks that oil should be the motor of development. But this is really what is sort of like the big challenge and the big dilemma in the Mexican case. We were able to accelerate very fast the energy transition, investing heavily and in a very competitive way in renewable energies. So we were opening the space, and we were going to comply with our Paris commitments of generating electricity. 35% of our electricity was coming from clean energy sources by 2024. Now we're moving away from that because we're burning fossil fuels to give an exit to Pemex for its fuel oil, which has a high content of sulfur and has no market for it. So I think, each country is different, and I don't know if there is, I cannot think offhand of another oil country that has a similar situation such as Mexico, but I know there are, for instance, coal-producing countries that could have other alternatives and who have more diverse economy, like the case of Poland, for instance, but that for political and ideological reasons, if you want historical reasons, are betting on on coal or are betting on oil, as in the Mexican case. And here is where I would like to come to something that Laurie mentioned, which is this issue about raising the stakes, raising the cost of silence. In the Mexican case, we have one that I think is absolutely outrageous, which is the mayor of Mexico City, who wants to be our future president. She's already one of the selected, candidates for the 2024 election. Well, she was part of the IPCC. She's a scientist who knows very well what climate change is and the impact this is having and the impact it is having on Mexico. But she's been silent about it. She's been supporting the policy of the government. And I think what is interesting about what has happened in Mexico is that government policy and this impact on promoting Pemex and allowing Pemex to not only impact climate change, but also the environment, has mobilized civil society. We have a civil society that is much more vocal, that is putting, not only putting proposals on the table, putting data on the table, but that is also bringing lawsuits. And there are several lawsuits against some of the changes in the legislation, in the electricity legislation that the government has promoted, to raise the bar and say, in the Mexican Constitution, health is a right, and energy, clean energy is a right because you're polluting the environment. So I think what is interesting is how we can have an impact by mobilizing all the different stakeholders, making them conscious of the impact that, for instance, burning fuel oil is having on the air that we are breathing. And for the first time in many years, Mexico City has had very high levels of pollution. And so, this is impacting our health as we are having a pandemic that impacts our lungs. So to make a very short story long, I agree with the strategy that Laurie has presented for IOCs, because I think it can also be used for NOCs in terms of the voice that society can have in pushing the government to change its policy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lourdes. That brings us to the end of our time. And, one comment in the Q&A was, this is such, great fodder for discussion. What are the plans for taking it forward? NRGI and IISD decided to organize this seminar, and it was my colleagues Patrick Heller and Greg Muttet who were leading the charge, because it seemed important to bring together experts in oil sector governance, representatives of national oil companies, as well as climate change experts and advocates, to come together and exchange expertise, because it's interesting, but also because we all know we need to do more in this area, that national oil companies have a long way to go in terms of responding to the energy transition, if we're going to make progress in fighting addressing the production gap. I think what today's discussion and the others have really helped to do is not just remind us how difficult it is or how diverse these actors are, but really shed light on how we might tailor strategies to suit different political contexts and to suit different industries. I mean, as some of you have noted, there's higher cost oil in some countries than others. Some countries are more exposed to the oil market and more dependent on oil than others. And all of these observations can help us craft the kinds of strategies that might be more successful, depending on the country in question. So in parallel to the public seminars, we've been having working group meetings that have kind of talked about the implications of the discussions. And we very much intend to continue prioritizing this topic, learning from each other, but also shifting to conduct action, to take action, including research and analysis and advocacy, etc. And so we look forward to staying in touch with everyone who's joined us virtually over these past events. Thank you very much to the speakers today who've been really excellent, as well as those who've joined for previous sessions. And with that, it's my honor to kind of close out this series of the webinars. and look forward to continuing to collaborate on this important topic of concern. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.